The billionaire CEO froze, staring at the woman he'd abandoned 3 months ago. She was pregnant. Very pregnant. His assistant whispered, "She's here about the contract." His racing heart screamed, "She's here about my child." Before we continue with the story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Oh, and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. We love seeing that. "Mr. Palmer, your two is waiting downstairs." His chief of staff. Eleanor's voice cut through the intercom, sharp and efficient as always. "And there's a woman here insisting she needs to deliver something personally." Matthew's jaw tightened, his hand pausing over the contract he'd been reviewing. "A woman?" "Yes, sir. Says her name is Juliet Jensen. Security offered to take the documents, but she's quite insistent it must be hand-delivered." Eleanor's tone held restrained disapproval, the kind reserved for people who disrupted carefully controlled schedules. Something cold and electric shot through Matthew's chest. That name. 3 months of silence. 3 months of convincing himself he'd made the right choice by walking away, shattered in an instant. "Send her to conference room B," he managed, his voice betraying nothing. "I'll meet her there." "Sir, she's already in the executive hallway." She bypassed reception using the contractor access code. Matthew was moving before Eleanor finished speaking. He strode through his office doors with controlled urgency, Italian leather shoes silent against polished marble. The hallway stretched before him, minimalist and cold, exactly how he'd designed his entire life. Then he saw her. Juliet stood near the glass railing overlooking the atrium below, framed by afternoon light that made her seem almost ethereal. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, those defiant eyes he'd memorized still holding that spark of independence that had captivated him from their first meeting. She wore a flowing burgundy dress that should have hidden everything. It hid nothing. The curve of her body was unmistakable, beautiful and terrifying. 6 months, maybe more. Juliet Jensen, the woman who'd made him believe love was possible, the woman he'd abandoned without explanation, was very clearly, devastatingly pregnant. Their eyes met across 20 feet of empty space. She straightened, one hand instinctively moving to rest on the swell of her belly, protective and proud. The other hand clutched a manila envelope against her chest like a shield. Matthew opened his mouth. No words came out. His brilliant mind, capable of negotiating billion-dollar deals in 3 languages, went completely, utterly blank. The shock wasn't just seeing her again. It was the math his brain performed in milliseconds. 3 months since he'd walked away. 6 months pregnant. The timeline aligned with brutal, undeniable precision. The baby was his. Juliet's expression shifted from guarded hope to something harder, colder. She'd seen his reaction, read his silence as the answer she'd feared most. "I'm here about the final contract amendment," she said, her voice steady but distant, professional in a way that carved into him. "Mr. Chen asked me to deliver this personally since I consulted on the original terms." She took 3 steps forward and extended the envelope, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. Matthew's eyes dropped again to her belly, then back to her face. His silence stretched between them like broken glass, sharp and cutting. It wasn't rejection. It was pure, paralyzing shock, colliding with a terror he'd never known existed. The fear of repeating every mistake that had taught him to guard his heart with ice and distance. But Juliet didn't know that. She couldn't read the chaos behind his frozen expression. Couldn't hear his heart screaming at him to speak, to move, to do anything but stand there like a statue. Her chin lifted slightly, pride masking devastation. The signature page is marked. That's all that's needed. Matthew finally found movement, reaching for the envelope, his fingers brushing hers for half a second. The contact sent electricity through him, the same spark that had consumed them both months ago, before he'd destroyed everything with cowardice disguised as self-preservation. "Juliet," he managed, his voice rough and unfamiliar even to himself. "Don't." She pulled her hand back as if burned. "Just sign it, please." His silence, born of shock so complete it stole every word he desperately needed to say, was the sound that shattered her composure and ignited the war between them. The conference room door whispered shut behind them, sealing out the hum of Palmer Tower and trapping the two of them in a silence that felt heavier than the glass walls around them. Matthew crossed to the far end of the long obsidian table, needing the distance, then hating it. Juliet stood near the doorway, one hand braced against the back of a leather chair, the other curved protectively along the swell of her belly. "Sit," he said, the command rougher than intended. She didn't move. "If this is about the contract, I won't be long." "This isn't about the contract." His hand flattened on the polished surface, veins tight beneath his skin. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her laugh was short and humorless. "You'll have to be more specific, Mr. Palmer." "You left without a word. There was a lot I didn't get to tell you." His jaw clenched. "You are 6 months pregnant, Juliet." You thought that detail was irrelevant. Color rose in her cheeks, but her eyes stayed icy. "I thought it stopped being your business the night you walked out and made sure I couldn't reach you." She lifted the envelope between 2 fingers. "I am here as a consultant. I delivered the paperwork. That is all." "That is not all." His voice dropped, the edge of panic slipping through. "You're carrying my child." Her fingers tightened around the envelope. For a heartbeat, he saw it. The flash of hurt, the tremor of fear. Then the shield came back down. "You assume a lot for a man who didn't care enough to stay for breakfast. That's not fair." The words came out, clipped, defensive. He pushed away from the table, advancing a step. "You should have told me, and you should have stayed," she shot back. "But since neither of us did what we should have, here we are. I don't need your money. I don't need your name. I needed a signature, and I have it." She tapped the folder against his chest, the contact, brief and burning. "Congratulations on the acquisition." He caught her wrist before she could pull away. "Juliet, don't." Her voice frayed on the single syllable. "You had 3 months to say something. You chose silence. I learned from you." His grip loosened. She stepped back, reclaiming her hand, reclaiming her pride. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the future hanging between them like a fracture line. Then she turned and walked out, shoulders squared, head high, every step measured despite the weight she carried. Matthew stood alone in the echo she left behind, heart pounding, mind already racing to the only thing he understood: control through information. Within minutes, his private line buzzed as he summoned his most trusted investigator. "I want everything on Juliet Jensen," he said, staring at the door she'd vanished through. "Where she lives, who she works for, her doctors, every detail." He ended the call, the word he couldn't say pounding in his skull. "Mine." The first call went straight to voicemail. So did the second. By the 5th, Matthew had abandoned his usual measured tone and was pacing his office like a caged animal. Phone pressed hard to his ear. "Juliet, call me back," he said. For the 3rd time that afternoon. "We need to talk. Now." No response. The text messages stacked beneath the unanswered calls, a litany of words he would never have imagined himself sending. "We need to talk. Are you okay? Please pick up." Her number stayed silent, the read receipts stubbornly absent, as if she'd vanished into a life where he no longer existed. It hadn't always been like this. 3 months earlier, his nights had ended with her laughter curling against his neck, paint smudges on her fingers as she traced idle patterns along his chest. The first time he'd seen her, she'd been standing in front of one of the pieces his company was acquiring for the executive lobby, arguing with a curator about lighting. Of all things. He'd watched her for 10 minutes before speaking, fascinated by the way she defended art like it was breathing. Within a week, she was in his penthouse at midnight, barefoot in his kitchen, stealing strawberries from a crystal bowl while he leaned against the counter, pretending he wasn't already falling. She teased him about his perfectly organized fridge, about the way his tie never loosened until she tugged it free herself. He'd learned the sound of her key in his door, the shape of her silhouette against his windows, the quiet contentment of waking to her, tangled in his sheets. Then came the call. He could still hear his sister's shaken voice that night, the one that had cut through the low music, and Juliet's soft humming from the bathroom. A betrayal buried in his family's past, an old financial wound reopened with brutal clarity. Accusations, lost money, the reminder that trusting the wrong person had once nearly destroyed everything he'd built. By the time the call ended, his pulse had turned to ice. Juliet had walked out of the bathroom in one of his shirts, hair damp, smile easy and unsuspecting. He'd looked at her and seen not the woman who'd spent weeks proving herself, but a risk he couldn't afford. A future that demanded more of him than he knew how to give. "I need you to go," he'd said. Voice flat, armor snapping into place. Her smile had faltered. "Did I do something?" "No." He'd stepped back, already reaching for distance. This was a mistake. He hadn't explained. Hadn't trusted her with the raw, ugly pieces of his past. He'd simply shut the door on her confusion, then blocked her number the next morning before he could change his mind. Now, listening to her voicemail greeting, knowing she was the one shutting him out. The truth slammed into him with suffocating force. She hadn't disappeared. He had pushed her away, then taught her exactly how to disappear from him in return. Matthew's investigator delivered the address within 36 hours. A converted warehouse in Brooklyn, repurposed as shared artist studios. The building looked tired, paint peeling near the entrance, windows patched with tape in places that made his jaw tighten. This was where she'd been living, where she was carrying his child. He found her on the 3rd floor, Studio 12. The door propped open with a rusted paint can. She stood at a drafting table, her back to him. One hand braced against the small of her spine as she leaned over what appeared to be design mock-ups. The late afternoon light caught the curve of her profile, the exhaustion etched into the set of her shoulders. "You shouldn't have to work like this," he said from the doorway. She stiffened, but didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here. We need to settle this." He stepped inside, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I've arranged everything. A penthouse in Tribeca, fully furnished. Access to the best obstetric team in the city. A monthly allowance that will cover anything you or the baby needs." Now she turned, eyes blazing. "Excuse me?" He placed the envelope on the table between them. "The first check. 200,000 to start. Consider it a retainer." For a long moment, she just stared at the envelope like it was something toxic. Then she picked it up, opened it with deliberate slowness, and pulled out the check. Her hands were steady as she tore it once, twice, 3 times, letting the pieces flutter between them like ash. "I am not for sale, Matthew," she said, each word precise and cutting. "And neither is this baby." His control fractured. "That's not what this is. Then what is it?" She crossed her arms over her chest, defensive and furious. "You show up with money and arrangements like I'm some problem you can solve with your checkbook, like this child is a transaction you can manage from a distance. I'm trying to help. You're trying to control." She stepped closer, eyes locked on his. "Let me be very clear. This baby is mine. I will raise my child alone if I have to. I don't need your penthouse or your doctors or your guilt money." The words hit like physical blows. His child. Hers alone. The future he was already terrified of, losing crystallized into sharp, undeniable reality. She meant it. She would disappear completely, take his son or daughter somewhere he'd never find them, cut him out entirely. "Juliet, you can't just—" "I can," she interrupted, "and I will. Now leave." He stood frozen, watching her turn back to her work, dismissing him as thoroughly as he'd once dismissed her. Pride and panic warred in his chest as he walked out, the torn check pieces still scattered on her studio floor. Physical evidence of exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. She didn't need his money. She needed something he'd never learned how to give. By the end of the week, Juliet's body felt like it belonged to someone else. The studio hours, the commute, the clients who wanted last-minute revisions, each demand pressed against the constant low throb in her back, and the tightness banding her ribs. She told herself it was normal. Pregnancy was hard. Exhaustion was expected. Besides, she couldn't afford to slow down. The warning came as a sharp cramp that stole her breath while she waited for the subway. She gripped the metal pole, willing the world to steady, then forced herself onto the train anyway. Just one more day, one more project, one more invoice paid. By the time she reached her building, her legs trembled with every step. Mrs. Alvarez from 4B opened her door at the sound of Juliet fumbling with her keys. "Mija, you look like a ghost," the older woman murmured, reaching for her elbow. "I'm fine," Juliet lied, edging past. "Just tired. I'll rest." She made it as far as the small living room. The room tilted, then narrowed, her vision tunneling to the worn couch she never reached. Pain speared through her abdomen, sudden and white-hot. Her knees buckled, the world dissolving into a roar in her ears. "Juliet!" Mrs. Alvarez's shout sounded far away. Strong hands eased her to the floor. Someone dialed emergency services, words about pregnancy and pain and weeks gestation tumbling into the air. Juliet's hand fumbled weakly at her bag. "Card inside," she whispered. "In case of emergency." The paramedic found it later. A simple card tucked beside her prenatal vitamins. One name, one number. Matthew Palmer. Matthew was in a late meeting when his phone vibrated with an unknown caller. He almost ignored it. Then something cold slid down his spine, and he answered. "Mr. Palmer? This is EMT Rodriguez. We're with a Juliet Jensen. You're listed as emergency contact." The room fell away. "What happened?" His voice came out hoarse. "She's 28 weeks pregnant. Severe abdominal pain and loss of consciousness. We're en route to Street David's. I'm on my way." He didn't remember the drive, only the blur of red lights and the pounding of his heart against the steering wheel. At the hospital, fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell assaulted him as a nurse thrust a clipboard into his hands. "Are you the father?" she asked. Brisk but not unkind. He thought of Juliet on that studio floor, of the baby he'd never met but already feared losing. Control, pride, self-preservation, all of it burned away under the weight of a single, brutal truth. "Yes," he said, signing where she pointed. "I'm the father." The pen scratched across the consent forms, his name binding him to them in ink and in blood. Juliet lay propped against a mound of hospital pillows, her skin washed pale against the stark white sheets. One hand resting instinctively over the curve of her belly. Monitors hummed a low, relentless rhythm around her. Matthew stood frozen at the foot of the bed, the collar of his shirt open, tie abandoned somewhere between the parking lot and the maternity ward. Her eyelids fluttered when she sensed him there. "You're loud," she murmured, voice thin. He moved to her side, fingers curling around the cool metal of the bed rail. "You scared everyone," he said softly, "including me." A knock at the door cut through the fragile quiet. Dr. Patel stepped in, clipboard in hand, expression composed but serious. "Miss Jensen, Mr. Palmer." She glanced between them, then focused on Juliet. "I'm going to be very straightforward. The baby is stable for now, but your body is under significant stress. Your blood pressure is high, and you're showing signs of preterm labor. You cannot keep living the way you have been." Juliet swallowed. "I've cut back. I'm trying. It isn't enough anymore." The doctor replied. "You need rest, consistent medical supervision, and a significant reduction in stress. If that doesn't happen, we may not be able to prevent an early delivery. And at this stage that would be dangerous for both of you." The words landed like lead. Matthew forced himself to breathe. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice rough. "Tell me what it takes to keep her and the baby safe." Dr. Patel's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "She needs stability. No overworking, no financial panic, no constant emotional upheaval." She looked at Juliet. "You don't get to be brave at your own expense anymore." When the doctor left, the room felt even quieter. Juliet stared at the ceiling, jaw tight. "I'll figure it out," she whispered. "I always do." "That's the problem," he said. He dragged the chair closer and sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "You shouldn't have to figure it out alone. Not when it's my fault you're here like this." Her eyes slid to him, wary. "Your fault?" He swallowed hard. The old instinct rose, deflect, redirect, bury, but the sight of the IV in her arm and the band of monitors strapped around her stomach burned through every defense. 3 years ago, he began. My uncle nearly destroyed my company. He used my name, my trust, to funnel money through shell corporations. By the time I found out, we were days from collapse. I spent a year cleaning up the mess, paying off debts I hadn't created, watching people I cared about lose everything because I hadn't seen the betrayal coming. Juliet watched him, breathing shallow and careful. "When I met you, it felt different. You were different. I let you in further than anyone since that disaster." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "The night I ended it, my sister called. The investigation had uncovered more, the full extent of what my uncle had done. Old panic flooded back. I looked at you and saw another risk I couldn't quantify. Another way to lose everything, if I trusted wrong." So you walked out? She said quietly. So I ran, he corrected. I chose silence because it was easier than admitting how much you mattered. I blocked your number because if you'd called, I would have caved in a second. His throat tightened. And in doing that, I proved I was exactly as cowardly as I'd sworn I'd never be again. Tears slipped sideways from the corners of her eyes, disappearing into her hairline. You could have told me, she whispered. You could have trusted me with the truth instead of just disappearing. I know. His voice broke on the admission. He reached for her hand, terrified she'd pull away, relieved when she didn't. He laced their fingers together carefully, mindful of the IV line. You and this baby are the only things I've ever wanted that weren't about power or numbers or control. And I treated you like a problem to manage instead of the family He stopped, exhaled. The family. I'm terrified of losing. Her fingers tightened, just barely. I don't know if I can trust you, she said. Not after all of this. You shouldn't, he answered honestly. Not yet, but I'm asking for the chance to earn it. To be here, to do this the right way. She searched his face, as if looking for the lie he'd always been so good at hiding. Whatever she saw there made her eyes soften. If only a fraction. Why now, Matthew? Her voice frayed. Why break the silence now? He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, tasting salt and antiseptic and something that felt terrifyingly like hope, because watching you on that floor in my mind is a nightmare I can't live with, he said. Because the thought of our child growing up believing they were an inconvenience I paid off instead of someone I fought for makes me sick. Because I would rather lose everything I built than lose you again. He drew in a steadying breath, meeting her gaze head on. I won't be silent anymore, he vowed, the words low and certain. I am staying. I am yours. Whether it takes you a day or a decade to believe it. For the first time since he'd walked into the room, something eased in her expression. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the faintest crack in the wall she'd built to match his. Then don't leave, she whispered. He squeezed her hand, anchoring himself to the fragile life pulsing under her palm and the one growing beneath it. I'm not going anywhere, he said. The penthouse felt too large, too pristine, like stepping into someone else's life. Juliet stood in the master bedroom, staring at the panoramic windows overlooking the city. Her single duffel bag looking absurdly small against the expanse of polished hardwood and cream upholstery. Matthew hovered near the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her with the intensity of someone monitoring structural integrity. The nurse will be here in an hour, he said. Dr. Patel insisted on daily check-ins for the first week. I know. She'd heard the plan 3 times already. The nurse, the nutritionist, the on-call obstetrician. It was thorough. It was suffocating. It was exactly what the doctor ordered. If you need anything, I'll ask. She turned to face him, exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. Matthew, you can stop hovering. I'm not going to collapse the moment you leave the room. He looked like he wanted to argue, then just nodded and retreated, pulling the door halfway closed behind him. The first 3 days passed in careful silence. Juliet rested on the sectional, propped up with more pillows than seemed reasonable, reading or sketching while Matthew worked from the dining table instead of his office downtown. They orbited each other like strangers sharing an elevator, polite and distant. On the 4th morning, she woke to the smell of something burning. She padded into the kitchen to find Matthew standing over a skillet of what might have once been eggs, smoke curling toward the ceiling. I'm calling for takeout, he muttered, dumping the charred mess into the sink. You don't cook? It wasn't a question. Apparently not. He glanced at her, sheepish in a way she'd never seen. I thought pregnant women were supposed to eat breakfast. Something loosened in her chest. Pregnant women also appreciate food that isn't carbon. His mouth twitched. Fair point. They ate bagels on the terrace instead. The morning sun warm and forgiving. Matthew asked careful questions about her work, her studio, the projects she'd abandoned. She answered cautiously at first, then found herself talking longer than intended about a gallery commission she'd been designing before everything unraveled. You miss it, he observed. I do. She traced the rim of her juice glass. But I can't exactly haul supplies and climb ladders right now. What if you didn't have to? He leaned forward slightly. What if the work came here? I could convert the guest suite into a studio. Natural light, proper ventilation, everything you need. She blinked. You're serious? Completely. You shouldn't have to give up everything because of bed rest. His gaze dropped briefly to her belly. Neither should they. The gesture was so unexpected, so thoughtful, that she didn't know how to respond. Thank you. The days softened after that. Matthew started working shorter hours, appearing in the living room mid-afternoon with tea or fruit, asking if she needed anything in a tone that had lost its edge of panic. One evening, he sat beside her on the couch, hesitant, and placed his hand lightly over hers where it rested on her stomach. Can I? He asked quietly. She nodded, guiding his palm to the spot where their baby had been kicking relentlessly for the past hour. They waited in silence. Then it happened, a strong, unmistakable thump against his hand. Matthew went completely still, eyes wide with wonder and something that looked like fear. That's... His voice caught. That's your daughter, Juliet said softly. Or son. We still don't know. He kept his hand there, feeling the tiny life move beneath his palm, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were bright. Hi, he whispered to her belly, voice raw. I'm sorry I'm late. Juliet's throat tightened. She covered his hand with hers, their fingers tangling over the place where everything had started and nearly ended. You're here now, she said. That's what matters. For the first time since she'd walked back into his life, it felt like the truth. The nights were when Matthew surprised her most. Juliet would wake from restless sleep to find him sitting in the armchair beside the bed, reading aloud from a worn paperback. His voice was low and steady, meant for the baby more than her, reciting everything from classic novels to articles about sustainable architecture. You know they can't understand Hemingway yet, she murmured one night, half smiling in the darkness. He looked up, caught. The research says they recognize voices. I figured I should practice. Her chest tightened. You're reading to our baby at 2 a.m. Is that weird? He closed the book, suddenly self-conscious. It's perfect, she whispered. The small gestures multiplied. He learned how she took her tea without asking twice. He'd appear with plates of cut fruit arranged with absurd precision, or adjust the temperature before she mentioned being cold. He never hovered with panic anymore, just steady, quiet presence that felt like safety instead of control. One afternoon, curled on the couch with her sketchbook, Juliet felt the familiar tightness in her throat that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Matthew looked up from his laptop, attuned now to shifts in her breathing. What's wrong? He asked, closing the screen. She shook her head, then found herself speaking anyway. I'm terrified, she admitted, voice small, of doing this alone, of not being enough, of something going wrong, and there being no one to. She stopped, pressing her palm to her belly. I've been so angry at you for leaving. But the truth is, I was already scared before you came back. Matthew moved to sit beside her, careful not to crowd. You're not alone, he said quietly. Not anymore. But what if you leave again? The question cracked open, raw and desperate. What if something happens and you decide it's too much, or I'm too much, and you just go silent again? He reached for her hand, threading their fingers together with deliberate care. I can't take back what I did. I can't erase the 3 months you spent wondering if you mattered. His jaw worked. But I can tell you this. I was wrong. I was a coward who chose fear over you. And I will regret that for the rest of my life. She looked at him through blurred vision. How do I trust that? You watch me, he said simply. Every single day. You hold me accountable. You call me out when I retreat into silence or try to solve things with money instead of showing up. He lifted her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart. I'm not asking you to forgive me yet. I'm asking you to let me prove that I'm capable of being the man you and this baby deserve. A tear slipped down her cheek. I wanted to hate you, she whispered. It would have been so much easier. I know. But I couldn't. Even when I was furious. Even when I convinced myself I didn't need you. She exhaled shakily. I still wanted you here. His thumb traced circles over her knuckles. I'm here. And when the fear comes back, when you wake up at 3 a.m., convinced something will go wrong, I'll be right there. His voice dropped. You're not carrying this alone anymore, Juliet. Not the baby, not the fear, not any of it. She leaned into him, letting his arm come around her shoulders, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing sync with hers. For the first time in months, the weight pressing on her chest eased just enough to let her breathe deeply. Tell me again, she said softly. That you're staying. He pressed his lips to her temple. I'm staying, he murmured. For every moment. The hard ones and the beautiful ones. All of it. She closed her eyes and let herself believe him. The contractions started at dawn, subtle at first, then building with a rhythm that erased everything but the present moment. Matthew was awake instantly, moving with controlled urgency that barely masked his terror. He'd rehearsed this 100 times in his mind, memorized the hospital route, packed and repacked the bags. None of it prepared him for the reality of watching Juliet double over, breathing through pain he couldn't fix. I've got you, he said, his hand steady on her back even as his pulse hammered. We're okay. We're going now. The drive blurred into a series of stoplights and her grip crushing his hand. At the hospital, nurses moved with practiced efficiency, hooking monitors, checking vitals, speaking in calm tones that did nothing to slow his racing heart. Juliet's face was pale, damp with effort, but her eyes stayed locked on his whenever the pain crested. Don't leave, she gasped between contractions. I'm right here. He pressed his forehead to hers. I'm not going anywhere. Hours collapsed into each other. Matthew lost track of time, aware only of her breathing. The numbers on the monitors, the increasing urgency in the doctor's voice. When they finally told her to push, Juliet's cry tore through him, primal and fierce. He held her hand, whispering encouragement he wasn't sure made sense, his own fear dissolving into awe at her strength. Then the room changed. The doctor's hands moved quickly, and suddenly there was sound, a sharp, furious wail that split the air and rewired something fundamental in Matthew's chest. It's a girl, Dr. Patel announced, lifting a tiny, squirming body into view. Matthew couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The nurse placed the baby on Juliet's chest, and he watched his daughter settle against her mother's skin, still crying but softening. Dark hair plastered to a perfect, impossibly small head. Oh my God, Juliet sobbed, her hands cradling the baby with trembling reverence. She's here. She's really here. Matthew reached out, his finger brushing the baby's miniature hand. Instantly, tiny fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. The connection was electric, undeniable, a bond that bypassed every defense he'd ever built. She's perfect, he managed, voice breaking. You're both perfect. Juliet looked up at him through tears, and in that moment, every painful misstep, every silence, every fear that had stood between them dissolved. They were no longer two people negotiating hurt. They were a family, forged in blood and sweat and a love too fierce to deny. The nurse eventually lifted the baby to clean and weigh her, and Matthew helped Juliet settle back, smoothing damp hair from her forehead. You were incredible, he whispered. We were, she corrected softly. When they placed their daughter back in his arms, wrapped in soft cotton, Matthew stared down at the tiny face and felt the full weight of what he'd almost lost. This life, this moment, this family. I'm your dad, he told her, tears tracking freely down his face. And I'm going to spend every day proving I deserve to be. The baby's eyes blinked open briefly, unfocused but searching, and Matthew swore she saw straight into the parts of him he'd kept hidden for years. Juliet's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. What should we name her? He looked between them, the woman who'd given him a second chance and the child who represented everything he'd never known he needed. Grace, he said. Her name is Grace, because that's exactly what they'd both given him. 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both chaotic and impossibly right. The penthouse echoed with the sounds Matthew had never imagined filling his carefully controlled space. The soft cries at 2 a.m., Juliet's gentle humming during feedings, the particular silence that came from watching their daughter sleep in the bassinet between them. Matthew had learned to function on fragments of sleep, to warm bottles with precision, to recognize the different tones of Grace's cries. But tonight, with Juliet's mother visiting to help, he'd orchestrated something that had taken more planning than most of his acquisitions. Where are we going? Juliet asked as the private elevator opened directly into the rooftop terrace. She dressed simply, still recovering, moving with the careful grace of new motherhood. "Somewhere we should have stayed," he said. The terrace had been transformed. String lights crisscrossed overhead, casting warm gold across the space. A small table sat near the edge, set with the same wine they'd shared on their first real date. The night she'd convinced him to leave a gallery opening early and talk until dawn about everything except business. The city sprawled below them, glittering and indifferent. The same view that had framed the beginning of everything. "Matthew," her voice caught. "You recreated it?" "Not exactly." He pulled out her chair. "This time I'm not pretending I don't know what I want." They ate slowly, talking about Grace's feeding schedule and the art commission Juliet was considering starting again. The mundane intimacy of shared life. But as the skyline darkened into full night, Matthew set down his glass and reached across the table for her hand. "3 months ago, I stood in my office and watched you walk away because I was too afraid to speak," he began. "I chose silence because it felt safer than risking everything on the terrifying chance that you'd become the center of my world." Juliet's fingers tightened around his. "But you already were. The moment you argued with that curator about lighting, the first time you fell asleep in my kitchen, every single second after." He stood, moving around the table, then lowered himself to one knee. Her breath hitched. "I don't deserve the second chance you gave me. I don't deserve the family we've built. But I'm asking anyway." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a ring that caught the string lights. A simple, elegant diamond, set in platinum, classic and enduring. "Juliet Jensen, you taught me that love isn't about control or calculated risk. It's about showing up, staying present, and choosing vulnerability, even when it's terrifying." His voice roughened. "Will you marry me? Not because of Grace, though she's the greatest gift you could have given me, but because I can't imagine spending another day without you as my partner, my family, my home." Tears streamed down her face. "You're really asking. I'm really asking. And I'll keep asking. Every single day, if I have to, until you believe I mean it." She slid from her chair to kneel with him, framing his face with her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. Because you showed me that people can change. That silence can be broken. That love is worth fighting for even when it falls apart." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close, kissing her with everything he'd learned about honesty and presence. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she laughed through her tears. "Grace is going to be so spoiled at this wedding." "Absolutely," he agreed. "She's already got me wrapped around her tiny finger." They stood together, looking out over the city that had witnessed their collapse and their rebuilding. Matthew wrapped his arms around Juliet from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. One hand splayed protectively over her waist where their daughter had once grown. "I love you," he said, the words he'd been too afraid to speak aloud until it was almost too late. "I love you both more than I thought I was capable of loving anything. I love you too," she murmured, covering his hand with hers. "And we're going to build something beautiful. Together." Below them, the city pulsed with life, full of stories beginning and ending. But here, on this rooftop where silence had once nearly destroyed them, Matthew and Juliet held each other and planned a future built on the hardest, most essential lesson they'd learned, that true love demanded vulnerability, honest words, and the courage to stay, even when fear whispered to run. They'd found that courage, and they weren't letting go. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.